I'm Christy. As I sat in my motel room, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I couldn't help but think about the events that had led me to this moment. The doorbell at my old house earlier that day had signaled the start of a reckoning that my son-in-law, Jake, and my daughter, Lily, would never forget. It all began when I was sitting in the living room, folding laundry as the TV played softly in the background. I had lived in that house for 12 years, ever since my husband passed away. Over time, I had become so accustomed to the place that I almost forgot it wasn't entirely mine anymore. Lily and Jake had moved in with me a few years ago, and while there were always a few tense moments, I never thought things would come to this. Jake walked into the room, his face set in a scowl. He didn't even bother to say hello. Instead, he reached for the remote and turned off the TV, his eyes cold as he looked at me. "Go to your room, old lady. This is my living room now," he said, his words like daggers. I looked at Lily, hoping she would say something, defend me. But she just stared at the floor, her silence like a punch in the gut. Something inside me snapped. I stood up, grabbed my coat and keys, and walked out of the house without a word. I drove aimlessly until my hands stopped shaking, then parked near a small motel. I sat in the car all night, not crying, but planning. Years ago, after my husband's death, I had learned to be self-sufficient. I had savings, important documents, and leverage that I had kept hidden away for a rainy day. By morning, my exhaustion had turned into clarity. I checked into the motel, ordered a cheap cup of coffee, and made a phone call to a lawyer I had known for a long time. I started to gather all the papers I needed, reviewing accounts and remembering every detail I had ignored for the sake of peace in the family. You see, that house wasn't as simple as Jake thought. I owned a significant part of it. And more importantly, when Jake was starting his business and no one else would invest, I had stepped in. I had signed the contracts quietly, trusted him blindly, and kept my mouth shut. But that silence ended the moment he disrespected me in my own living room. As the day went on, I made arrangements. I worked with my lawyer to prepare the necessary papers. By evening, everything was in motion. I slept better that night than I had in years. The next morning, my phone buzzed with missed calls from Lily. I ignored them. Instead, I met with my lawyer. He was a calm and patient man, and he confirmed what I already knew. I had legal options, fair options. He asked me if I wanted revenge. I told him no. All I wanted was respect. Papers were prepared, notifications were scheduled, and boundaries were drawn in ink instead of tears. When I left the lawyer's office, I felt a sense of freedom, not power. I imagined Jake's face when he finally realized the reality of the situation. It wasn't out of anger that I thought about it, but with the understanding that arrogance has a price. Back at the house, the morning seemed ordinary. Lily was making breakfast, and Jake was checking his phone, annoyed by emails he didn't understand. Then the doorbell rang. A man in a suit stood outside, calm and professional. He introduced himself and handed over an envelope. As Jake and Lily read the papers, confusion quickly turned into panic. The ownership details, the contracts, and the deadlines were all clearly laid out. The living room that Jake had so arrogantly claimed as his own suddenly didn't feel like his anymore. Lily finally spoke, but it was too late for excuses. That night, as I watched the sunset from my motel window, I knew this was only the beginning. The doorbell wasn't the end of the story. I was ready to take back what was mine and ensure that I was treated with the respect I deserved. I remembered the early days when I first met Jake. He seemed like a nice young man, full of dreams and ambition. Lily was head over heels in love with him, and I was happy for her. When they asked if they could move in with me after they got married, I didn't hesitate. I thought it would be a wonderful family arrangement. But as time went on, Jake's true colors started to show. He became more and more controlling, and he didn't seem to respect my place in the house. I tried to ignore it, for Lily's sake. I didn't want to cause any trouble in their marriage. I also thought about the day I decided to invest in Jake's business. He came to me, desperate for money. His business was on the verge of collapse, and no one else would help him. I saw the determination in his eyes and decided to give him a chance. I used a large portion of my savings to invest in his company, believing that he would make it successful. I signed the contracts without much thought, trusting him completely. I didn't ask for much in return, just a small share of the profits. But as his business started to do well, he seemed to forget about my investment. He never mentioned the profits, and I didn't want to seem greedy, so I kept quiet. But that fateful day in the living room changed everything. His disrespect was the last straw. I realized that I had been too passive for too long. It was time to stand up for myself. I continued to work with my lawyer over the next few days. We made sure that all the legal aspects were in order. I knew that Jake and Lily would be angry, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be treated fairly. Lily called me several more times, but I still didn't answer. I knew she was probably trying to convince me to back down, but I was firm in my decision. I wanted her to understand that I couldn't be treated like this. As the days passed, I could only imagine the chaos back at the house. Jake was probably trying to figure out a way to get out of the situation, but he had no choice. The contracts were legally binding. I also started to think about my future. I didn't know what would happen next, but I was ready for whatever came my way. I had my savings, and I could always find a new place to live. One day, I received a call from Lily. This time, I decided to answer. She was crying on the other end of the line, saying how sorry she was. She said she didn't realize how much Jake's behavior had hurt me. I listened to her, but I didn't say much. I knew that words were not enough. Actions would speak louder. I told her that I was willing to talk, but only when she and Jake were ready to respect me. She promised to talk to Jake and get back to me. A few days later, I met with Lily and Jake at a neutral location. Jake looked nervous, and Lily looked remorseful. They both apologized, and Jake promised to make things right. I could see the sincerity in their eyes, and I decided to give them a chance. We worked out a new arrangement. Jake would pay me back the money I had invested in his business, with interest. He also agreed to respect my rights in the house. Lily promised to be more assertive and stand up for me when needed. As I left the meeting, I felt a sense of relief. It wasn't easy, but I had finally stood up for myself. I knew that the road ahead would still be challenging, but I was ready to face it with a newfound strength. The doorbell that day may not have been the end of the story, but it was a turning point. It was the moment when I took control of my life and demanded the respect I deserved. And as I looked out at the sunset, I knew that a new chapter was beginning.